Thank you for joining the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Northwestern Division for today's conference call covering test flows from Fort Peck Dam. This call is open to the public to provide information on the status of test flows from Fort Peck Dam to ensure compliance with the 2018 biological opinion. I am Eileen Williamson, and I will be your moderator. This call is recorded and placed on the Defense Video and Imagery Distribution Service for media reuse at www.dvidshub.net/unit/USACE-NWD. Your participation acknowledges your consent to be recorded. All lines have been placed on mute. To unmute your line to ask a question, press *6 or use the unmute function in the webinar application. Forced mute may not work on all phones, so if I ask, please use your phone's own mute function and do not place the call on hold. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the call. Our agenda today includes John Remus, Chief of Missouri River Basin Water Management Division, Joe Bono, Manager of the Missouri River Recovery Program, and Pat Broughton from the U.S. Geological Survey. With that, I'll hand the call over to John Remus.
Thank you, Eileen, and thank everybody for getting on today. I hope everybody got the communication on Monday that we decided to go ahead and run the second peak of the test. If you didn't get that, please let us know so we can see where our communication gaps are. We did decide to go ahead with the flow, or excuse me, the second peak. We did begin ramping up on Monday morning. We are currently at about 14,500 CFS discharged from the dam. Our target is about 14.5 at Wolf Point, and almost all that's going to be coming from Fort Peck Dam. About 12,000, give or take, is coming through the powerhouse, and the other discharge for the next few days will be coming from this during the peak, excuse me, will be coming from the spillway. I think that's all I have for now. Pending any questions, I'll turn it over to Joe.
All right, thanks, John. We'll hand it to Joe and take question and answer at the end of the call.
Okay, thanks, Eileen. I just have a couple updates on the physical monitoring. So because the dates of the start of the second peak moved a little bit, we had to make some adjustments. The surveys of pump sites, the aerial imagery in particular, we wanted those to be conducted during the peak flows. So since that changed, we had to do some adjustment to contracts. So we got that done. So the physical monitoring that a lot of folks are interested in is still going to occur during the peak as planned. So that those efforts will be starting here in a week, little over or about a week now as that peak occurs. So from the physical monitoring side, that's all I have to cover. Only other updates I think are on the fish side.
Great, thank you, Joe, and we'll hand it to Pat.
Thanks, Elaine.
You still there, Pat? I heard.
Yep, I am. Sorry about
okay.
that. I had to hit a button on my thing here. So as in the previous weeks, I will step back to the beginning of the flow modification project, give you a summary of the discharges and the fish, the pallid sturgeon in the Missouri River response reaches. So I'll first start with discharge. That's going to be on the left side of your screen on the axis there, mean daily discharge. And I have the two lines. The gray line is Culbertson discharge. The black line is the Wolf Point discharge, and that is the target location for the flows. So we start off in early April through about April 25th or so. Flows out of Fort Peck, just slightly above, slightly below 6,000 CFS. Not a lot going on with those flows. beginning April 26th. The flow increases do start. Flows peak out at about 18,000 CFS at Wolf Point. Things slightly delayed at Culbertson just due to the travel time. And this first pulse was the attraction flows. The hypothesis behind this was to do just as the name says, attract fish, pallid sturgeon, to the upper reaches of the Missouri River if possible. So after the first set of flows, the attraction flows were diminished, and we entered the second part of the test, and that was the retention flows. And the hypothesis behind the retention flows, as the name does imply, is to retain fish in the Missouri River response reaches, anticipating the next set of conditions, and that would be the spawning. So during this retention flow period, flows did diminish. And here we are now, June 17th, when things kicked in. And that is the start of the third phase of this flow test, and that is the second flow pulse. And the hypothesis behind this is to initiate the aggregations of pallid sturgeon and really cue these fish for the spawning process. So now I'll move into the pink line, and that's on the right, on the axis on the right side of your screen. And that's just the number of telemetered pallid sturgeon in the Missouri River upstream from the Yellowstone River confluence. So this is the response reach, or a couple of reaches. So we start out in early April through initiation, the attraction flows, and there were 15 to 17 telemetered pallid sturgeon in the system. As the attraction flows increased, some fish did move into the system, some moved out as well. So you had the immigration-emigration dynamics going on. But ultimately, after the attraction flows progressed through their whole series, there were 23 to 26 telemetered pallid sturgeon in the system. So now we move into the, well, some of those fish moved out as well during that retention flow period. In particular, there were 2 wild females that moved out. These were wild fish, code 262, code 272. However, 3 of the reproductive hatchery females remained in the system. These were codes 337, 342, and 422. And at this point, we're right around 20 telemetered pallid sturgeon still in the response reach. There's some question marks there. There are a couple of fish with older transmitters, the old 620 frequency that were found earlier in the season, but they haven't been found in recent tracking runs. So those tags could have expired. They could get weak. We're not hearing them, but we're right around the 20 fish mark. And as I mentioned, the second pulse was initiated on June 17th, and we will see what happens, what kind of response we get from that. Okay, next slide, please. And just to give you a visual, put these fish locations on a map. You can see where they are. So as of the last couple of tracking runs, just the last few days, the pallid sturgeon, telemetered ones, are distributed from that Oswego area, river mile 1731, which is partway between Fort Peck and Wolf Point, all the way down to the Snowden logging station, where one of those missing fish had its last detection. So they are spread out through the system, but tending toward a couple of clusters, as you can see from the map. So the reproductive females, the hatchery ones I did mention, have stayed in the system. We have codes 342 and 422 in that Oswego area, just between Fort Peck and Wolf Point. Code 337, another reproductive female, is right around the Poplar River confluence, based on our last location just the other day. So not only do you have the 3 reproductive females still in the system, there are a fair number of reproductive or suspected reproductive males as well. And these are based on blood steroid concentrations and also the ultrasound assessments. For example, the hatchery origin males that code 114, 285, 289, 379, 394 are still in the system. And there is 1 wild male pallid sturgeon still in the system as well, and that's code 240. And as we are going through this presentation today. Crews are on the water, getting the latest locations for all these fish. And that will do it.
All right, thank you, Pat. And we'll move to the question and answer session. If you do have a question, you can raise your hand. There's a little hand right next to your name in the webinar application. You can raise your hand to ask a question or come off mute when I call your state. Looking at the app, I do not see any hands up. So we will field questions from callers, starting with the state of Montana. Don't see any. North Dakota, Iowa, Kansas, oops, Missouri, Nebraska, South Dakota, Wyoming, anyone we may have missed or who wasn't able to get to the microphone to come off mute. Not hearing anything, I'll let John close the call.
Thank you, Arlene. Thank you, Joe and Pat, for your participation today. One thing I failed to mention in my opening remarks, instead of going, I don't know if people understand, we are no longer going to a 22,500 CFS flow target at Wolf Point. We're going to 20,000 at Wolf Point, and the reason for that is our retention flow was a little bit less than we had planned, so it's the same amount of up and go to the peak, but the peak will not be as high. We will be reaching the peak, or should be reaching the peak Sunday, and we'll hold it for 3 days. By our next call Wednesday, we should be starting on their way down. I'll give one last chance for either questions or any comments that Joe or Pat would like to say. Hearing none, thank you again, and we'll talk to you next week, same time. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes today's call.
Thanks.
Thanks.